But tonight, we're actually here for a subject matter that's really close to us here at the museum, around the Turnbull settlement and the Minorcan community that set the stage and the beginnings for the community that we know as New Smyrna Beach and this southeast Volusia County area. Our speaker tonight is actually a Minorcan descendant for her first credential. She's also a professor emeritus of Flagler College there in St. Augustine, where she was the director of the Minorcan Studies Project. Please join me as we welcome Darien Andreu.
Thank you, Greg. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak here, and for you all making time to come out and participate. As a Minorcan, coming back to New Smyrna, this is like a homecoming, you know. So, and I've admired your museum for so many years, and I only wish we had something like this in St. Augustine for visitors to appreciate. So we are grateful for all you do to tell the Minorcan story here in New Smyrna. This afternoon, I want to talk about what happened to the Minorcans after their hardship years on the Turnbull plantation here in New Smyrna in 1777. You document that experience ever so well, and in a way, that dramatic story about the Minorcans is almost enough. You know, we can just stop right there. That's a trilogy. But yeah, how did the Minorcans move on from broken promises and dashed dreams and get over the fact that they never received the land they were promised, and that only 400 of the original 1,403 people who they made the journey over the Atlantic with, only 400 of those people survived 9 years later to make that walk up to St. Augustine. And then there's 964 family members that are buried here in New Smyrna somewhere. We don't know. In St. Augustine, the Minorcans, after they made that 70-mile walk north, 4 days, 3 nights, after being released from their contracts here in New Smyrna, they had to start all over again. There was not housing in British St. Augustine for them at that time, so they were living in barns and sheds and palmetto thatched homes, roofs, once again, and it was tough. It was tough. For me, though, my interest in Minorcans, let's see, all things Minorcans started with my dad. He's a descendant of 2 Minorcan families, the Andreu and the Ortegases, and you should have a brochure that is about the Minorcans, that the Minorcan Studies Project put together. I'll talk about that a little bit later, that project. But on the back of it, there's this little green box toward the bottom that has 48 names of Minorcan families who were still living in St. Augustine in 1975 when this Minorcan statue was commissioned and unveiled. So there were 114 Minorcan families, but there were also many Italians and many Greeks. I don't know how many families total, but 1,403 folk. And these were the 48 names who remained in 1975, and are still in many ways. If you come to St. Augustine and drive around, you will see the Usina Bridge. You will see Passetti Plumbing. Andrew's Land Clearing, and so forth. The names are still in the area. With my dad, when it came time for me to fill out a college application, I was excited. I saw the box that said, do you check, do you white, black, Hispanic? And I was like, oh, I should check Hispanic, right? And he was like, no. And I wondered, what's up with that? He was an accountant, and at times exasperatingly exact. To ask for directions was, and so for him for me to be exact about that was curious. And a similarly curious thing happened when I first moved to St. Augustine to teach at Flagler College back in 1987. And when I married, I as a Minorcan, I kept my surname. And Andrew, and because I was eager to connect with people in the St. Augustine area, with last name or other Minorcan names. But honestly, for the next 25 years, that didn't happen. I mean, I guess it was me. It's on me. I was busy. People are busy. But it just seemed curious that there wasn't a conversation about Minorcan heritage, Minorcan cultural heritage. As you probably well know, the Minorcans is a collective term now, and it refers to a whole group of ethnicities that were a part of that original Minorcan community here in New Smyrna. So there were, in addition to Minorcans, there were Italians, there were Greeks, there were Corsicans, there were a few Frenchmen who were brought over to maybe work on, vineyards. Lots of optimism, and in here in New Smyrna, Minorcans are, the community's first residents, and so I guess I get it when it comes to St. Augustine that the Minorcan story is essentially overcome or subsumed under, St. Augustine talking about its Spanish colonial heritage, and Ponce de Leon, and Pedro Menendez, and the Castillo, and on and on and on. But another reason that I think maybe Minorcan heritage is dismissed in St. Augustine is due in part to Minorcans' own eagerness just to move on from those days of hardship. When they were indentured servants. In St. Augustine, Minorcans for centuries were second-class citizens. And they were referred to as Turnbull's Inward. And that slur is still with us. It's spoken of at times in muffled tones, but that conversation's there. And so it's the old story, like many immigrant groups, Minorcans were anxious to leave behind the stigma of being indentured, of being dark-skinned, and of being of servile extraction. This is one of my favorite Minorcan features in St. Augustine. This is the Minorcan mural that is in the Cathedral Basilica. Right downtown on St. George Street. This is behind the choir loft. It's a little more difficult to see now than it used to be. A story for another day. But it shows the weary Minorcans coming in through the St. Augustine gates, right? Having made that walk from New Smyrna, and you've got a British redcoat there. You have a priest. This is probably Father Camps, even though he came much later, or months later, from New Smyrna. And you can see the oxen is very thin. I mean, so this was painted by Hugo Ohms, German muralist for the St. Augustine's 200th. And I find it very beautiful and very how it catches the sigh of relief of people finally making it to St. Augustine. As Minorcan scholars tell us, Pat Griffin wrote Mullet on the Beach, Phil Rossico, who wrote Minorcans of Florida. The Minorcans, after a time in St. Augustine, became upwardly mobile, and they lost their folk ways. They forgot their Catalan language. Today, my father's family still strongly identifies as Minorcans, but we only remember, maybe a handful of words. One handful. I can only remember one, yeah. But it's in the decades that passed, for Minorcans in St. Augustine, with the continual changing of flags from British to Spanish to U.S., the Minorcans each time stayed on. And they eventually became St. Augustine's old-timers. And they've lived in St. Augustine now, or in Florida, for over 250 years. But unheard of, right? And as a matter of fact, in 2027, Minorcans will celebrate 250 years of living in St. Augustine, having made that trip in the summer from here to there and starting anew in St. Augustine. And plans are being made right now as we speak. Greg Holbrook is a driving force behind it all, along with my friend Lee Craig, to celebrate the 250th in 2027. Because at times Minorcans have even been the majority population in St. Augustine, like right after the British left, and then again before and probably after the Civil War. Today, there's an estimated 30,000 Minorcans in St. Johns County, and so that's maybe 1 out of every 10 people you meet. So that's sort of 300,000 people in St. Johns County right now, and that's just with the recent population boom. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 35 years ago, the number would have been even greater. But here's the thing: many Minorcans no longer carry those Minorcan family names. Right? For example, the St. Augustine Historical Society has a place called the Lambias House right across from the oldest house, the Lambias House. Lambias is a Minorcan family name. That name's no longer in the area anymore. And luckily we have the house to remind us of the Lambias family. Because essentially, these Minorcan names at one point or another have married out. Right? So now we have Minorcans named with last names like Michler and Cooley. You'll see streets with, Michler and Floyd and Craig and Saxon. Or Minorcans have potentially anglicized their last names. So Benet became Bennett. Andrew, my name pronounced in Catalan is Andreu. I think it's so beautiful. But it's, make it American, and it's Andrew, not even with a U, with a W, or add an S. And so, in a sense, like many immigrant groups, they've wanted to Americanize. So, to wrap up this section, in a sense, the Minorcans of St. Augustine are like the Cajuns of Louisiana. Both groups have come from far away, they spoke another language, and they stayed on to become the old-timers with their culture and cuisine. But of course the Cajuns are much better known and much more widely celebrated than the Minorcans in Florida. And so we hope that changes. Who are the Minorcan Americans after St. Augustine? Well, broadly speaking, they're St. Augustine's fishermen. They were St. Augustine's fishermen, boat builders, boat pilots. For years, you couldn't get into the St. Augustine harbor without hiring yourself a Minorcan pilot to get you over the bar, across the bar. They were St. Augustine's carpenters. When I first moved to St. Augustine, there was a well-regarded builder in town named Walter Andreu. I was like, yeah. I didn't know him, but I heard only good things. I knew by the spelling of the last name, right? And more recently, when my husband and I needed a new roof on our house, we made sure to look in the phone book, or on the internet these days, and we found a Minorcan named Curtis Manussi, and been in the building business, the roofing business for quite a long time. I think it's into a fourth generation, maybe, for sure, that I know of. They were the city's masons. The Reyes family, R-E-Y-E-S, had a business called North City Stoneworks. And you can move around town and see some of the old coquina walls are ones that they've built. And the Minorcans, in the Mediterranean, stone cutting was a time-honored profession there. My relatives were shrimpers and fishermen and they had moved up to Mayport, so my great-grandparents. And they took jobs in Jacksonville as bridge tenders and lighthouse keepers in St. Augustine. So my father's side of the family is descended from Maria Andreu, and she became a lighthouse keeper, one of the early, just before the Civil War. Sad story, her husband fell to his death. They had a large Catholic family. People wanted to see them, maintain and continue, and so she was given the responsibility for lighting the light until the Civil War came to St. Augustine, and the lens had to be removed. So that was Maria Andreu. If you visit at the old watchtower there, the skinny one in the middle, you go to the new tower now, of course. It's that story is told there among many others, the light keepers who were of Minorcan backgrounds. Minorcans, of course, were civic leaders, politicians, military men, and there's so many to choose from that I'd like to talk about tonight. But I'm going to focus on three in particular, and the first is someone named Stephen Vincent Benet. He was a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner of poetry, and he himself didn't grow up in St. Augustine, but his great-grandfather, Pedro Benet, and his grandfather did, who became a brigadier general, Stephen Vincent Benet, who the poet then, the grandson was named for. So Pedro Benet, just a little background to set up Stephen when we talk about the poet. Pedro Benet grew up in St. Augustine during the British period and the Second Spanish period, and he was described by his son as an ambitious, hardworking, and an enthusiastic American. Pedro Benet was one of the early kings of the Minorcan community, and I'll talk about, there are four informal Minorcan kings of the community, sort of one with each 80 years or so. His son, Stephen Vincent Benet, not a poet, but later a general, was the first appointee from the new state of Florida to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He graduated third in his class, and even today on the West Point campus, there's a building named for him. So when the Civil War broke out, son Stephen became, as it turned out, President Lincoln's right-hand man in terms of advising on ordnance, cannon technology in particular. Today there's frequent recognition that in St. Augustine that the Minorcans fought on the side of the Confederacy. And it's a little known fact that the two highest ranking Minorcan military figures in the Civil War conflict stayed with the Union. So the first of those was David Farragut, the first admiral with the U.S. Navy. Okay, he wasn't of this original Minorcan colony, but he was a Minorcan descendant, came over later, born in the Knoxville area. he of the famous Battle of Mobile fame, uttering the famous rallying cry, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, right? In Minorca, Farragut is still celebrated. There is this beautiful, large, beautiful statue on the waterfront of the old capital, Cittadella, and where, you know, the Farragut statue is. By contrast, after the Civil War, when General Stephen Benet returned home to St. Augustine, this native son was not warmly welcomed. And this hurt his father very, very much. So here are the Benet grandchildren. And they went in a completely different direction. They were bookish. They loved libraries. They loved to write. And it's these people that, more than anything, drew me into, you know, as a former teacher of American literature, that connected me to my Minorcan heritage. These three Benets, Laura, William on the far side, Stephen, the youngest on here, closest to me, were, in a sense, the gatekeepers of American literature in the first half of the 20th century. I mean, in some ways, that's hard for me to believe, because they've been subsumed by the Ernest Hemingways and the T.S. Eliots and the F. Scott Fitzgeralds and the Zora Neale Hurstons. You know, these figures edited magazines, were judges of contests, Yale Younger Poets, and they're largely now, you know, forgotten, but they shouldn't be. And they were good folk. The Benets grew up on military posts from California to Georgia. The oldest, Laura, went to Vassar, and her two brothers went to Yale. Stephen, the youngest, was a literary prodigy from very early on. He published his first book of poetry at 17. Or his first book of poetry was published. He didn't publish it himself. As a military kid growing up with a grandfather who was a general in the Civil War, he was immersed in stories of the conflict. So of course he would turn to Civil War material to write. And by age 30, he had won his first Pulitzer Prize for the book-length poem, John Brown's Body. John Brown was the man who led the slave rebellion up at Harper's Ferry, which many historians argue was the tipping point for leading the country into civil war. And this poem that Benet put together, it has some 15,000 lines. You know, it's segmented, it's in sections. It takes up to 300-400 pages, depending on the edition you're holding. And it's amazing. It has more than 40 different characters, a wide range of socioeconomic classes that Stephen writes from those different points of view. It uses an admirable number of poetic forms. So Benet depicts Lincoln and Lee in blank verse, and by contrast for the cavalier young Southerner, he uses these galloping heroic couplets. And then there's the slavers and the enslaved and the Southern belle and an army deserter and a Western settler and a spy. There's an occasional ballad and a rare sonnet. And for John Brown, the freedom fighter or the fanatic, depending upon your perspective, Benet uses these hard, monosyllabic, single-syllable free verse lines. And so, given time, I would love to explicate this poem for you in all its nuanced magnificence. But my husband has this rule of thumb for presentations, and he says, concentrate on the interesting parts. So I'll save that close reading for another time. So maybe this anecdote will be more interesting. In a letter Margaret Mitchell, who had yet to complete her Civil War masterpiece, Gone with the Wind, recalled in a letter to a friend that when someone started reading her passages from John Brown's Body, she said, "I flung myself on the sofa, stuck my fingers in my ears and screamed. I wondered how anybody could have the courage to write about the war after Mr. Benet had done it so beautifully." Apparently she figured out how to do it ever so well. And Stephen Vincent Benet reviewed her book and reviewed it warmly. Was glad to see it. Margaret Mitchell was terrified of his review, but it's all good. As we talk about a little more about literature, I hope in particular this would be of interest to you here in New Smyrna. Before Stephen Vincent Benet published John Brown's Body, he wrote a book called Spanish Bayonet, and it's his Minorcan novel, pulling on his family Minorcan stories. It's set right here in New Smyrna. Again, he's working from family lore, and he's telling the story of the Minorcan colony. The fictional place is not New Smyrna, it's New Sparta. There's a manipulative landowner, abused indentured laborers. Is this sounding familiar? And Stephen wrote this, having yet to visit Florida. So, which is part of the problem. This is not Pulitzer Prize literary quality. Nevertheless, it's an important Minorcan document, you know, and I love what he was trying to do. But Stephen's best known work today probably is this. He wrote the short story, The Devil and Daniel Webster. It's a clever little short story. In the spirit of an American tall tale, it's about a desperate New Hampshire farmer who sells his soul to the devil for 10 years of prosperity, and then hires the great orator, Daniel Webster, to plead his case in front of a jury handpicked by the devil. That Webster out-argues the devil by claiming an American cannot serve a foreign prince, and that even the corrupt among us have advanced the American experiment. The Devil and Daniel Webster, this short story was a huge hit. The movie that followed 5 years later was a huge hit. And the short story itself was a unanimous selection for the O. Henry Award for the best short story of the year. And the short story and the movie together would pay Stephen Vincent Benet's bills for the rest of his life. John Brown's Body did too, but poor investments in 1929 and things like that. But Daniel Webster provided a living. Stephen Vincent Benet only lived to age 44. He died of a heart attack, but he won a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for another epic-length poem called Western Star, and it's about the American country. It was unfinished when it was published, but still in pretty good shape. And so my husband and I always speculate, gosh, if he had had a little more time, would he have pulled the Minorcan story into it? Because it's not there as much as we can tell. To wrap up this section, William Stevens' older brother won a Pulitzer Prize for The Dust Which Is God. And there's passages in that which refer to his Minorcan heritage, as does his sister Laura in a short story called Children of St. Augustine. And this is a short story set in the time of the Patriot War in St. Augustine. The kids in there, she was a young adult writer, are named Pedro and Juana after her grandparents. And these kids very bravely flee through the woods a fair number of miles to warn the soldiers at the fort of an imminent attack. on the Spanish fort by those marauding Americans up there on the other side of the Georgia border. You know, such were the politics at the time. In sum, you know, the Benet family brought dignity and distinction to the Minorcan story, with their works, with their lives, as would the next Minorcan we're going to focus on, a woman named Judy Canova.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? All right. She was a Minorcan Turnbull colony descendant who, like Stephen Vincent Benet, found success in Hollywood. She ended up with 2 stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. One for radio and one for film. Yeah. She was known as the Minorcan Queen of Corn. Corn as in corny, right? That was her humor. And maybe that's Minorcan humor. You know, kind of like bad humor, something like that. She described her birthplace of Stark, Florida, as a mighty small Florida town, just a hoot and a holler from Gainesville and Jacksonville. She was a cut up in school, and her teacher once reprimanded her, saying, "You're not in vaudeville." And she said, "Pretty soon." The Canova homestead is still visible in St. Augustine at 46 Bridge Street. It's now part of a very nice luxury hotel, the Collector. And it's just a hoot from City Hall, just about 50 steps across the road from the Lightning Museum. And the Canova family were 5 generations descended from this New Smyrna colony here. But as had a number of Minorcan families after when the Civil War came to St. Augustine, they left town when the Union forces came. A lot of Minorcans went to Savannah, to Georgia. Others went out into the more rural areas, Elkton, Hastings, Stark. So that's where her family moved. By age 12, though, she was performing with her brother and sister, and they called themselves the Three Canovas. And they began traveling for vaudeville bookings. Her beloved hillbilly character was developed by chance. There was one theater they were playing in that needed a 3rd act that had canceled on them. And so she said, "I'll do it," you know. And she played this hillbilly character with this ear-splitting yodel, which actually disguised her fine soprano voice. Once she was asked if she had learned to yodel in Switzerland, and she said, "Lady, if Switzerland's in Georgia," I guess I did. She had cousins in Georgia. As Judy got older, she stepped away from the trio to act in movies. Her first starring role was in the movie Scatterbrain, 1940. And she played this clueless country character, blundering her way into swanky Hollywood places. Her country bumpkin role, in a sense, served as a prototype for the Beverly Hillbillies, you know, Petticoat Junction, Green Acres, Hee Haw, Carol Burnett. In a sense, and Republic Studios, who had signed her, promoted their star in this kind of backhanded way. She's an attractive girl, full of zip, and has a very alive face, which makes up for any deficiencies in beauty. Irony. But the big hit another big hit for Judy was the movie Sis Hopkins. In this movie, she established her catchphrase that she was known for, where she would say, "You're telling I." And this was, and whenever she said this was followed by cowbell ringing off stage, and then she'd tug on her trademark pigtails. In 1943, she signed a contract with Colgate-Palmolive for her own radio show. It was wildly popular. The Judy Canova Show ranked among the top 10 radio shows in the 1940s, and for 10 years. It ran for 10 years. And her pigtails became a fad on college campuses. Would have liked to have seen that. Maybe it'll come back someday. Over her life, she married 4 times. She lived in Hollywood and was well off and well known. She made appearances on the Dinah Shore Show, the Mike Douglas Show, Love Boat, and one of her daughters made her acting debut in Happy Days across from Ron Howard. So Judy Canova died in 1983, in a sense having given country folk and Minorcans a beloved cultural presence in Hollywood. So grateful to Judy Canova. A third Minorcan who loomed large in the 20th century, but on the St. Augustine home front, was named Xavier Lopez Pelletier, known to his friends and family as X. X. If you go into the Historical Society in St. Augustine to do research about Minorcans or Pelletier, all you have to do is ask for the X-Files. That's what you're talking about. We got those for you. And what's so cool is X Pelletier was a direct descendant of Francisco Pelletier, who was the first king of the Minorcans here in New Smyrna, who led them from St. Augustine to, New Smyrna to St. Augustine. Here are those 4 kings. This is Francisco Pelletier. This is a Polaroid someone took of him while he was on the beach. It's been passed down. Pedro Benet painting, and then there's a sketch of Bartolo Genovar. And I will talk about each of them in just a few minutes. But I just want to say a few words about Francisco Pelletier. He was a skilled carpenter as part of the Turnbull colony here. He helped build Turnbull's plantation home, okay, here in town. Maybe out near the airport. Is that where you all think? Pelletier was one of the 3 Minorcans who bravely slipped away to St. Augustine, from New Smyrna to St. Augustine, to appeal for release to the governor of East Florida for the Minorcans' release from the New Smyrna plantation. They had fulfilled their contracts here. Some contracts, like Francisco Pelletier's, only 6 years. Others were 10, but most people had fulfilled their contracts. And Turnbull had told them, sorry, you're not going to be released from these contracts. You didn't read the small print until, the plantation begins to make a profit. And at that point, you're paying off your debt. So they felt like they had done their job. Francisco Pelletier and his accomplices came back, and then the summer of 1777 led the abled New Smyrna colonists to St. Augustine up Old Kings Road, right? The inland route. And it was a 4-day walk to freedom. Pedro Benet, just for a moment here, he was a great-grandfather of Stephen Vincent Benet. He led the St. Augustine Minorcan community through a volatile a 40-year period known as the Warden's Period in St. Augustine, and that's when there were no Catholic priests in St. Augustine who could speak Catalan or Spanish. They were all Irish priests, and so nobody got along. There were issues about money, and so he was the leader of the Catholic community, keeping things going until Spanish-speaking priests could be found. And then there's Bartolo Genovar, known to friends and family as B. Genovar. And we have some family descendants here of Bartolo Genovar who could speak to his legacy much, much better than I can. But I will say in short that he's was a very successful St. Augustine Minorcan businessman. maybe remembered best today by people who aren't family, for building Genovar's Opera House. A big opera house. It sat 700 people right on St. George Street. And it brought in celebrities the likes of the boxer Jim Corbett and the Order, the Black Order and abolitionist Frederick Douglass spoke there. But back to X, the fourth king of the Minorcans. He was a go-getter. He was a real go-getter and a man of many talents. He was a vice president of Barnett Bank. He was a longtime president of the St. Augustine Historical Society. He helped bring the Pulitzer Prize winner Stephen Vincent Benet, the poet, to speak at St. Augustine in 1941. He was the founding chair of the St. Augustine Airport Authority. He was the president of the Florida Forestry Association. He started the first Catholic Boy Scout troop in Florida. And after his death, I could go on, but after his death, he was named one of our state's great Floridians. At age 13, he had an after-school job downtown at the Ask Mr. Foster travel agency, where his employer, the guidebook writer Charles Reynolds, talked with the young Pellissier about his Minorcan heritage. And he said, X said that Reynolds told him of his ancestor, Francisco Pellissier, being one of the leaders of the Minorcan colony when they moved from New Smyrna. And, X had grown up in a St. Augustine community where Minorcans felt like they were second-class citizens. And from that point on, Pellissier said, I vow to be proud of my Minorcan heritage. And he indeed led what became a 20th century Minorcan Renaissance in St. Augustine. When it came time to celebrate the American bicentennial in 1976, he worked all his life on many Minorcan initiatives, but before 1976, he was determined the Minorcan story was not going to get left out of the American bicentennial story. And so what he did first was he hired a St. Augustine record reporter, a crack reporter named Jane Quinn, and he commissioned her to write a book about Minorcans in Florida. It's out of print. Hopefully, maybe someday it can be brought back in print, maybe for 2027, because it should be. But he found the money to send her to Minorca to do research on Minorcans, and in particular on Father Camps. He is the individual that is holding the cross, right, of this statue that sits next to the Cathedral Basilica in St. Augustine. And Father Camps was amazing. There was no priest to go with the Minorcans who left from Minorca when they came across the Atlantic, and he agreed to leave his home and go with them. He was going to stay a short period of time, for a while in New Smyrna. But things got hard, and he stayed on and saw them through those ordeals here, and then again in St. Augustine, the 964 burials he performed, and really, it's a miracle. He should be a candidate for sainthood, Do you know anybody? He was just, he was such a good person. And his goal was to go back home, back to Minorca someday, and he never got that chance. He stayed in St. Augustine, passed away in St. Augustine. He's buried under the altar in St. Augustine, or buried under the altar of the church before it was enlarged. Now he's in the middle of the church among us all, so that's lovely. And the second thing X did was commission, so this book came out in 1975, right, a year before 76, and then the statue was commissioned, the Father Camps Minorcan statue. And what X did was partner with a friend he had made in Minorca, named Dr. Fernando Rubio. It was a well-to-do pharmaceutical businessman with, and physician. And the two of them just were bread and butter. They went to great lengths to find a talented sculptor, and they commissioned this bronze statue. It weighs 3 tons. Okay, it's a little larger than life size. You can visit it on St. George Street in the West Garden next to the cathedral. And he held a grand unveiling of the statue in 1975 before the bicentennial. And the unveiling included then Florida Governor Reuben Askew. Dignitaries from Minorca came over. It was a really special event. You meet some Minorcans today who were there when that happened. I wish I had been. And there's X himself, pulling the sheet aside. On each side of the coquina base, there are plaques, explanatory plaques that are really, really nice to read. And what's really cool, if you ever get over to Minorca, it's a charming place to visit. It's an island that's only about 40 miles long and 10 miles wide, and it sits off the coast of Spain, off Barcelona, about, an 8-hour ferry ride. It's way out there. And it's like one of the furthest out Balearic islands into the Mediterranean, which gave it this really wonderful deep water port that made it very militarily interesting and important. If you fly into the new capital, Mahon, you can and spend some time there, you can take a short trip inland up to the highest point on the island, and there's a half-size Minorcan statue that Rubio and Pellissier had placed there on the highest point of that Minorcan island. And so Minorcans, not all, but many Minorcans are aware of the Minorcans that became American. And I bumped into a woman who's a Minorcan who teaches at the University of Miami. She came visiting St. Augustine, and we were able to cross paths and have coffee. And she was like, we're very curious that you all as Minorcans still remember being Minorcan, 250 years later, and we remember you, and we appreciate you. And she says, but people like me today, when I go home, they tell me that, why do you want to live over there? I mean, we've got paradise here, beaches, small community, and great restaurants, and on and on and on. But anyway, times were hard when the Minorcans left New Smyrna. There was drought, several years of drought and crowding. Time to move along. But yeah, it's a point of pride for Minorcans who visit the island of Minorca to make that trip up to the top of the mountain. It's really not all that much of a mountain, but it has these really steep switchbacks. And for me, a Florida flatlander, I was terrified driving. Hire a driver. So, the Minorcan statue, the Minorcan monument was so dear to X.L. Pellissier that he asked that an image of it be carved on his headstone. And so if you drive into the San Lorenzo Cemetery in St. Augustine, near Winn-Dixie, great funeral home, and if you drive into the San Lorenzo, it's like one of the first headstones you'll see on the right, or the left, and you can visit there. There are many Minorcans buried there as well as around town. To close this section, I could tell you so much more about X.L. Pellissier, and I would love to, but as the record reporter Jane Quinn wrote about him, she said, excuse me, few Minorcans realized until his personal campaign on their behalf how unique their history was how courageous their forefathers were, or how much in tune with the 13 colonies were the pioneer Minorcans who revolted against a British tyrant. Pelletier took great pride in the fact that the Minorcans were a hardy band of settlers who were the largest group of Europeans to ever immigrate to the United States during the colonial era. Yeah, they included Jamestown. Yeah. X believed the Minorcans had a heritage unique in the nation, and that no other group had set its mark so distinctly on the oldest city, St. Augustine. In sum, X.L. Pelletier championed the enlightened view that to be a Minorcan was to be one of the first families of America. So, to wrap up, you can find out more about the contemporary Minorcan story at this website that's on the back of this brochure at the bottom here. It just launched about a month ago. It's still in its infancy. Welcome your recommendations, comments, contributions. One last thing. If you're interested in information about contemporary Minorcans, I have a friend, Leonard Pelletier, who has just written this book called Minorcan Boy. He's just turned 80. He grew up in St. Augustine, these last many years, and in particular during the controversial years of the 1960s, civil rights 1960s, and he's written about it in this novel, this fictional account. And I recommend it. And I think it'll be for sale here in your gift shop. So all the proceeds go to your museum because Leonard is a descendant of X.L. Pelletier and Francisco Pelletier, and really appreciates, as many a St. Augustine Minorcan does, all you do for the Minorcan story. So thank you.